Yeah, I thought I could start with, I guess, with a slightly random question. But I guess I like asking, as I said, these kind of side topics a little bit. So, when did you start playing the drums?
I started playing the drums roughly when I was, well, it was during my service in the army. It's a funny way to say it. Yeah, I just, in my army service, I was exposed to some army bands, and they had a lot of instruments and musicians. So I just, started playing the drums, and there was a drummer there that treated me seriously and started teaching me, and that's how I got into it. Before that, I played the piano, but I always wanted to play the drums, and that was my way in.
Interesting. I just assumed that you'd started playing it in childhood or something and got... It's funny, I always get slightly jealous of people who play the drums because I always wanted to play the drums when I was a child, but I wasn't allowed to. I mean, I played all sorts of other instruments, but the drums were always too loud. But I guess hearing that, I realized I can probably still start as an adult, yeah.
Yeah, so I was relatively an adult, right, kind of around the age of 18, but then I had my own salary, and I lived kind of in a separate unit at the house, and I could just make my own decisions more independently. So that allowed that me to just go ahead and do it.
Okay. So, I mean, I saw somewhere, I think this might be on the Amygdaloid's website, I think it was. It said you started a band in your childhood called the Rebellion Movement. But that was on piano then, I'm assuming, or was that on drums?
No, that was after I started playing the drums. Then my first band, the one I joined, was the Rebellion Movement, which is a play on words in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you say, Nuata Mary. Rebellion is Mary, and we just had our lead singer, her name was Mary. So that was our play on words.
Okay. I was curious, what exactly is Hebrew rock? Is it just rock in Hebrew, or does it have specific...
Yeah, rock. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just a language. It's not. Rock. I was wondering whether there's something different about it other than the language.
Yeah. Yeah, you just pronounce it like rock.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, how did by the way, is the Amygdaloids are you still playing together? Or is that, I don't know how...
Yeah, in principle, we're still a band. But in the last few years, Joe Ledoux, who's the band leader, he kind of went unplugged, and he's playing with a guitarist and singer-songwriter that actually I play with also. We kind of split into small bands. So that has been easier for him during the pandemic and in terms of traveling. But every now and then we do a reunion. For example, one of the band members got married, so we played a little bit during the wedding, or we had an anniversary. So every now and then there are events that we get together. So we never formally separated.
It's never been a big breakup of the band.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the main thing, what we mainly wanted to talk about is kind of your work on, let's call it social navigation or cognitive maps for social interactions or social behavior. The one thing that really surprised me about this in some sense is it seems to me that most of your previous research, before, I guess, 2015, seemed to be very much from the kind of memory direction. I'm just curious, how did you kind of go from the memory literature into now? I mean, you're still continuing there, right? And your lab webpage says the description is, can we change our emotions? Our lab is interested in discovering the neuromechanisms underlying emotional control and flexibility. Then you mentioned traumatic emotions and patients with anxiety and that kind of stuff. I'm just kind of curious, how does the social space kind of work fit into that, and how did you get to that from your previous research?
Yeah, it emerged in an interesting way. I was studying traumatic memories and fear memories and how you can modify them. And there was a period where I heard several stories, personal stories from people who underwent genocide, during World War II. And in a few instances, it seemed that the people who survived and were highly functional had a very acute understanding of their social environment, which was surprising for their age and the conditions. For example, you could have a teenager, usually without parents, all hell breaks loose are surrounding them. Of course, no internet or radio, it's like nothing. You're surrounded by enemies. Sometimes your neighbors are the enemies. And the way they described their behavior was through very good understanding of what's going on at the social level. It's like who's a friend, who's an enemy, what are their motivations, and they could figure out how to interact. And that seemed to play a big part in their survival and how kind of they managed their environment. And I thought about it in one instance, and then I heard another story that popped out again, and I started thinking that it's actually really important for survival for you to map, to understand your social environment. And at that time, I had a postdoc that was terrific. That's Rita Tavares, and she made a huge transition. She actually came from immunology, and she also we took some time, each of us kind of to think what are we interested in. We knew we wanted it to be something social, but wasn't clear what. And she was also interested in social aggression and social defeat. So we kind of quickly converged on the question of how one maps their social environment. And we came up with the idea, we assembled a team, and from the idea of how to analyze the data, we came to the conclusion that it might be using something like polar coordinates, angle and vector, which were prominent in other areas of the brain. For example, in visual cortex, and you could see these types of encoding. Said, okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's probably how it's done, and we assumed it's the hippocampus, and we came up with the dimensions. It started kind of more intuitively that, of course, we map along the dimensions of power and affiliation, but then we also found a great deal of supportive literature. So that was the initial idea. We came to it from the idea that it's important for survival, and it allows you, it gives you some resilience. Even if you're the most inferior in the hierarchy, you would be better off because that type of representation allows you to understand and make predictions. And so that was the idea. And then we realized that we actually have a home. And that home was the home of the relational learning. Kind of Howard Eichenbaum at the time really opened the door for us and told us, you belong here. Because we considered it as spatial-like and kind of encouraged us to frame it more as relational learning, where spatial is one case and we are another case of it. And it goes along with these many instances. And at that point, that was nice because this is when we realized we do have a home. Before that, we were just weird. We didn't belong to the PTSD field. We didn't belong to the social field. We didn't really belong anywhere. And that was the natural home. So the nice thing is that we really didn't come up from the cognitive map. We just arrived at it, from a whole different direction. And since then, we've been working in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, that's the aspect that I find really interesting because I guess especially in your review in Neuron, you mention, I guess also in the review in Journal of Neuroscience, you mentioned very much these kind of two perspectives on the hippocampus. The one is kind of this, let's say, more the memory side. I studied psychology, so like HM and hippocampal lesions, that kind of stuff, that's super famous for that. And the other side is kind of spatial navigation, place cell, grid cell kind of area, that you have these kind of two different interpretations of what the hippocampus is for, and that these kind of cognitive maps might combine the two. And I guess for me, it's particularly interesting to hear that you come from the memory side, because it seems to me that, or most of the, let's say I basically, even though I studied psychology, come more from the place and grid cell side. So I guess I'd especially like to learn a little bit more about kind of the memory sides. I mean, could you maybe kind of just, I mean, I already mentioned kind of the two perspectives. Can you maybe kind of flesh out especially the kind of memory side more, and kind of what, kind of the key aspects from that literature that should be in, how should I put it? That, I mean, if we want to kind of create a theory of what the hippocampus does, kind of what are the key elements of the memory literature that should be included in that I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, the two fields of studying the hippocampus, as you said, were spatial navigation and episodic memory. And interestingly, they're very much studied apart by different people, different conferences, different journals, and so forth. But some people, especially Howard Eichenbaum, which was a great influence for me, came up with a theory that there's a joint mechanism of relational learning. That is, you organize information in a map-like organization if you have several dimensions that are continuous and need to be linked. So that's how you organize them. You find a relationship between dimensions. In memories, the way you can see it is with a sequence of episode. Just like you have sequences of steps that animal is navigating, here you have sequences of episodes, and they could occur in different contexts. And that type of sequence is what you represent. These are your data points that you organize, just like you organize locations in space. And that type of relationships use the same basic code of relational learning. The idea is that these are different cases of relational learning. Other ideas are that everything started from spatial representation and was built on it. These are two, I think, current prominent ideas in the field. It's not really testable. I think it's like theories with assumptions, right? There's no empirical evidence for that. It's just you can consider what is the most plausible theory. But these are two interesting aspects of how to link. And beyond these two, so it started that the hippocampus had this main dichotomy of you either study episodic memory based on the patients who lost their memory after hippocampal lesion, and then fMRI activations and so forth in relation to episodic memory, and then the other, the spatial navigation. Now, or after, in the last few years, it evolved to multiple domains. Suddenly you find sound spaces, navigation along a frequency domain, and olfaction, and any manner of like abstract spaces. So now, instead of having this dichotomy, it's like a new era, I think, in the hippocampal research, where you have this like multidimensional approach, sharing a fundamental code or way to organize information.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned like kind of all these sound and all these kind of things, and I mean that's the part I think that I really liked about your review, is that you had this section called, I think, increasing abstraction or something like that, and I really like kind of how you like laid out all the I guess getting increasingly more abstract and showing that this is, a very general thing and it's not specific to kind of one, sensory modality or one particular kind of behavior. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I really liked that section because I guess there was also quite a lot of stuff in there that I didn't know about until I read it in your paper.
Yeah, I think I can say something about that, which is what I like most about the idea of the social space, is that it's, I think, the most extreme case of abstraction. Because if you start with the physical space, everything is concrete, right? It's based on actual navigation in the physical world and sensory information. Then you can go to other sensory domains like sound and olfaction. Then you can increase abstraction by organizing rules in the environment, like categories. But it's still based on visual categories. For example, you would see a group of items and they will be clustered under a rule, which is abstract. But it's still tied to some sensory information that you organize in a rule-based manner. And also, in many instances, participants are tasked with learning specific locations, and these locations are rewarded, or they are required to map some organization. In the social space, there's none of that. They really just interact with people. They're completely unaware of the dimensions of power and affiliation. They're not instructed at all to map anything. They just interact. So it's latent in that sense, that it's implicit, not instructed, and not rewarded. It's not a task that they need to perform. And from that highly naturalistic behavior, we can extract these locations and the organization in the abstract space. So in this sense, I think it's a very interesting support for the idea of this shared code, even when you remove all these elements that might be alternative explanations.
Yeah. Shall we maybe go into a little bit more detail about the study you did on power and affiliation and, representing that in a social map? You mentioned earlier that a lot of your inspiration for this came from talking to people who had traumatic memories and that kind of thing. I'm curious, is that why you chose power and affiliation as categories? Because they were important from that context? Or, I'm just kind of curious why you chose those two dimensions as social dimensions.
Yeah, it started, the very first thought was intuitive, in the sense that if you do need to come up with dimensions, usually it's hierarchy and intimacy, right? You can see across species that hierarchy is important for survival, right? There's aggression, or hierarchy is built through aggression. And then there are reproductive bonds, which are the affiliation part, or familial bonds. And in our society, there's hierarchy and affiliation. Then if you think of other dimensions, they usually converge back onto these. For example, you can think about, let's say, attractiveness, trustworthiness, kind of different words you would find. They usually end up being about affiliation. So we realize that these dimensions are clusters of these different terms. There's no commitment to terms. And we found a lot of support in social psychology theories dating back to the 60s and the 70s, how people organize or understand interpersonal behavior that was on the axis of dominance and love. And then Alex Todorov had a model of trustworthiness and dominance. This was data driven. He found that this is what people get from facial features to evaluate these faces. They kind of organize faces along these two dimensions. Another model was from Susan Fiske, who talked about warmth and competence, which is how we assess people's abilities and then their intentions, or what they aim to do, and then their ability to act upon it. And depending on where you put them on that space, will lead to some stereotypes. For example, people who are incompetent and have, let's say, good intentions, then you would feel sorry for them, and so forth. So that was, we found these two dimensions across a large set of theories. And there was also the theory that relates to psychological distance, which again suggests that we represent psychological distance along multiple domains. It could be spatial, temporal, social, and these dimensions could interact and interfere with each other, but there will be a presentation from an egocentric perspective. So these are just examples of different theories all converging or providing support to that idea that these are two fundamental dimensions. But we never thought it's just these two. This for us was just an approximation. You start from the fundamental ones, and then you might increase the level of complexity. But to begin with, if there is any such representation, even if it's multidimensional, then these two dimensions would be a good approximation of it. Yeah, so that was our starting point.
Yeah. So basically, if this social stuff is embedded in a map in some sort, then these two features would be definitely part of that because they're two of the most important ones. And okay, yeah. Maybe can you then? I guess we've kind of been tiptoeing around the paper a little bit for the last few minutes. Just kind of briefly summarize kind of what you did in that paper and what the main findings were of that.
Yeah, we created a story. We really wrote a story. We had a research assistant who was very talented and funny and used to write for Saturday Night Live. So we had a lot of fun writing the story. And we came up with these interactions. There were a lot of decisions to be made about what is a power interaction, what is an affiliation interaction. So it's a storyline that you go through as a character. And then you interact with different characters. You come to a new city and you have to get acquainted with the characters, and your goal is to find a place to live and to find a job. And currently you're jobless and you're living in a sublet. So you interact with the characters, they approach you, and they come with kind of different scenarios. It's a continuous story. It's like a little movie. And then you make decisions, and the interactions are divided into power interactions and affiliation interactions. For example, the first character is this person who used to be with you in high school, and she's like, hey, what are you doing here? And kind of very happy to see you. And then she goes for a hug. And this is an affiliation interaction because it's about physical warmth and physical touch. And then you can decide if you go for a long hug or just give her like a brief pat on the back. Yeah. And in this case, you choose. If you can imagine a game board with her on the game board with these two axes, if you chose a brief pat on the back, at this point she went one step away from you. But if it was a long hug, then she would go one step toward you. These are the steps in this two-dimensional map. Power interactions would be, for example, there's this boss character that everybody likes, but kind of this, extreme personality a bit. So that person will say, "It's like, so how badly do you need the job?" And or it could say, "I need you to stay late." And these are situations where you can say, "Yeah, sure, boss, whatever you need," or you can say, "Well, are you gonna pay me extra?" Or "I can't, find someone else," and all that. So again, the character will go up or down in power. And the idea that you really behave naturally, you follow the story, and based on your choices, we translate it into this movement in the two-dimensional space. And what we get out of it is trajectories. The characters move. They have this trajectory. They started from an arbitrary point of neutral power and some distance from you, from which they can go away or close to you. And then they move. So you can see it like lines developing over time. And this is what we measure. That's the geometric model that we have for your social relationships. After you play the game, we create this map, and then that's a way to quantify your behavior. Now we have numbers. For each interactions, we have coordinates. We have the vector length. We have the orientation. We can look at the sum of these trajectories. For example, if you change your mind a lot, let's say you give power, take power, give power, take power, or get closer and away, the trajectories wouldn't develop. You will just go back and forth, which will end up with very short vectors and overall a very small space. Or let's say if you reject everybody, they will all go toward one quadrant, and it will be a narrow space. Others will have different types of varieties. So they will have a wider space. All these are quantities that we can measure. And the important thing is that it's a way to quantify ongoing relationships, which we didn't have before. It just gives us numbers. So then we can take these numbers and make predictions out of them and say, well, if the brain is representing information in that way, then we should see brain activation that correlates with these coordinates, with these dynamics or changes. And we tested that and found that the hippocampus was tracking the orientation of the angle. The posterior cingulate cortex was tracking the vector length. And the interesting thing was that the degree to which the hippocampus was tracking the coordinates correlated with people's self-reported social anxiety and some deficiencies in personality traits. So it seems to be the case that if you don't represent the world in this way, you're worse off in terms of your social functioning, which was consistent with the initial intuition that you do need that to get along, to survive.
Mm-hmm. So I just had to laugh because I guess you're in New York, and sometimes that comes through the background of police sirens and honking horns and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I also, I'm in a hospital, so you're bound to hear multiple
Sometimes it sounds like there's just mayhem behind you. Um, yeah, I mean, so one kind of question I had whilst I was reading the paper, and to some extent, I guess you kind of already explained this to some extent, but I guess I'll still ask the question, is kind of what I've kind of thought when I was reading the paper. One thing was like, this seems like a really like an almost unnecessarily complicated task, right? Like if you compare this, for example, to the Constantinescu paper, where they just, they have the birds with the different neck length and leg lengths, and then you move from one bird to the next, and you have this like very simple, I mean, at least comparatively very simple task. Like one kind of question I had is like, why is it such a story-like task and such a, I mean, just like even from a practical perspective as a scientist, like why go the length to have all these stories and all that kind of thing, rather than just presenting people with different attributes on the screen or something like that? Could you comment a little bit more on this kind of why why this kind of like intricate story with, or what do you call it, choose your own story, whatever it's called, kind of why you went with that route rather than something a lot simpler?
So the complexity of the task, it's interesting because my entire research before that was based on fear conditioning. So, it couldn't be more controlled than that, right? You have stimulus, shock, stimulus, shock, stimulus, stimulus, that's it. The most controlled possible. I think one aspect was that I just started my own lab, and it's something like you break free. So you kind of do something wild. But beyond that, it didn't really scare us that it's complicated. Quite the contrary, because if you take such a noisy environment, but carefully isolate one component in particular, if the component truly exists, then it will come out and everything will be canceled out. In a way, you kind of protect yourself from confounds, because when you have it highly controlled, you really have to omit a lot of parts, and some parts that you wouldn't omit could interact with it. Also, the task, for example, Continescu, it's still, as I mentioned, it's still sensory. You still organize sensory information in the environment. So we had to do something that really reflects social interactions, and that's it, right? I mean, really the way to interact is to have a person approaching you, and you're responding to that person. So the naturalistic aspect of it was really required to get at the question. And the other consideration was that stories are very engaging. We're kind of naturally drawn to stories, and you quickly embed yourself in a story. You don't need much. You just need a good story. And in this sense, we trusted that people will have that experience. Yeah, so I think the approach is to go naturalistic as much as possible, but not to aim to model the mess, or the complexity, but rather approach it mechanistically and isolate this one process or algorithm that goes through that noisy environment, and it's supposed to come out.
One thing that slightly surprised me, about this is that specifically about the findings with that the angle that correlated, the angle of movement through the social space correlated with hippocampal activity. I mean, what do you think the kind of, it's not exactly what the mechanism is here, but one thing, or maybe I'll kind of backtrack a little bit. In one of your reviews, you kind of mentioned that one really cool thing about having these two completely separate kinds of literatures is that you can draw inspiration from the other to have new ideas, new methods, all this kind of stuff. And taking inspiration kind of from the, let's say, spatial navigation literature, the hippocampus is in this case is the the place where you're at in this, let's say, two-dimensional space in this case, but it's not, and grid cells would be movement through it and these kind of things. But angle, that would be something more like a head direction cell or something like that, right? Or like, I'm just curious, like, why did you go specifically for angle and look for correlates of that and not. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, for example, one thing I was curious about is because I knew about the Constantinescu paper first. So when I heard about in your paper, I assumed, for example, you were also using a kind of this hexadirectional analysis. So I guess I'm kind of just curious, like, kind of why you chose this particular kind of fMRI analysis.
Yeah, the angle is an interesting choice compared to the rest of the literature. We wanted to find a way to quantify location. And polar coordinates are convenient in that sense because you get the angle and the length, and that gives you the location. So with these two, you can find where people are, and that's what we were going for. We didn't go for grid-like representation at that point. This requires many samples, kind of sampling in that environment to fill out the grid and find correlates. So that was kind of our initial approach. And it is true that it's something like head direction. We thought about it like orientation. Because if it is a space, you kind of orient toward one direction versus the other, and then there's the distance from you. And we also assumed it should be egocentric because of that literature on psychological distance, and just the idea that when you interact with characters, it's relative to yourself. For example, you will have only half the field. It's 180 degrees because there's no people behind you in that space, right? Unless you conceptualize time or history, of relationship as something that goes behind you. So that was really just the initial, as I said, like it was so wild that we kind of went with these approximations. And it says, okay, if it is true, then we find something like this. It wasn't easy to interpret because the more the angle was kind of toward one direction, which usually goes with high power, then we saw more activation, that is higher amplitude, which is not easy it's not like place cells, right?
Yeah,
because
exactly.
places fire the same, just in different locations. Yeah. So that wasn't definitely the end of it. We continued analyzing and definitely needed additional methods to fully flesh out this idea. But that was the initial intuition, the idea that it should be from your perspective, egocentric, and it's a form of orientation. Since then, we did additional analysis that are closer to place-like representation. We used a representational similarity analysis. And the idea is that if you have two characters in your space, if they're close, then the neural activation should be more similar to these characters as opposed to characters that are far apart across the trials during the task. It's not published yet, but it's on bioRxiv. And that gave additional evidence or more direct evidence for location per se rather than orientation. But we're still working on it. We want to see whether there's overlap between the representation of the location and the angle. Because I think these are different types of information that are represented and somehow integrated in the hippocampus. You have the egocentric and the allocentric. And it may be even a more complex type of representation that we're looking at now.
Yeah, but it just seems to me that the one unfortunate aspect of fMRI is that place cells are just really, I mean, from what I can tell, basically impossible to really get at. Yeah, I mean, I guess grid cells are to some extent through the analysis that Christian Doller introduced, or some other things. But yeah, it just seems to me that place cells are particularly difficult to get at with fMRI.
Yeah, we are started collecting data from epileptic patients with intracranial recording. So this, I hope, will get us closer to the animal electrophysiology literature.
Yeah, but that's kind of cheating. No, but that's
it's amazing.
No, I mean, obviously it's fantastic, but Yeah, I guess like the thing is just I guess it's very different kind of research, and I guess ideally you'd have something that you can do with healthy people, but yeah, I fully it seems like kind of intracranial recordings seem to be the only real way of getting at them right now.
Yeah, we're also now analyzing data from 7 Tesla, so that gives you better signal to noise ratio and greater resolution. Yeah, still not neuron level. It's just like you need really converging evidence.
Yeah. I mean, I had one kind of general question I had that maybe I can ask now is kind of like how to think about. I mean, one thing I really wonder about with these stuff is kind of not necessarily the reproducibility of these studies, but more the kind of, how should I put it? I mean, it seems to me very intuitive that, especially given all this other literature that already exists from animal literature and all this kind of stuff, it seems very intuitive to me that we would have something like, we should be able to measure something like grid cells or play cells in humans, if we can do so, but that in principle they should be there. So, and one thing I wonder about is maybe it's more like about publication bias or something like that, where it just seems to me every time if you don't find this kind of encoding of something, then it's more likely that it's a methodological problem rather than that the phenomenon doesn't exist. And I'm just like one thing I'm just wondering about is like to what extent kind of there are lots of null findings maybe out there that people quite reasonably maybe assume is more like a methods problem rather than that the phenomenon doesn't exist, whereas maybe something isn't actually encoded in humans in this way, but that we kind of make this false interpretation. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
I guess like it's not really a question, but like kind of how do you deal with that kind of thing? How do you think about that when you do your own studies? Because I don't know.
Yeah, I actually did my PhD in animals. I did animal models of schizophrenia, which were also based on fear conditioning. So I did start with the basic neuroscience approach before I switched to humans. And when you're in the field of human neuroscience, the idea is not to accept any findings in animal for granted. That's why I think it's important to have that layer in between animals and the clinic before you go to patients to see how it is in the neurotypical human brain. And indeed, it could be different, not necessarily in humans. I think Nachum Molanovsky found some different, I think something related to theta oscillations, or I don't recall now, but something that was different actually from the mice findings. So these are empirical questions. They should be tested, but you do need to take into account the method before you reach conclusions. Actually, in humans, there is some evidence from that electrophysiological recordings in patients with epilepsy for some grid cells and play cells. There is some,
Yeah. I mean, my point. I guess I'm not. That's kind of the whole point. Kind of, I'm not really doubting that it exists in humans because it seems like, in more or less similar ways, it seems to be the case in different species, and there are these few patient studies in humans. I guess at least I've noticed in myself this kind of assumption that it's probably going to be more or less the same in humans if it's that way in all the other animals, and that maybe I'm less critical maybe sometimes when reading some of these studies because I go like, oh yeah, it should exist. It kind of makes sense. It fits into the literature.
Yeah, the literature of fear conditioning and the circuits of acquisition of that learning are remarkably similar across species. So you could assume, for some circuits that they're highly conserved, but probably there are some additional layers on top of them, or the inputs are different, or something like that. But these are, I think, empirical questions.
Yeah, where someone with some very good methods expertise can really make a difference and figure out how to get at this in fMRI in particular, or even MEG. Who knows? Yeah, I mean, to slightly kind of broaden it from from your paper into more general discussions about this. I mean, I guess we've already been doing this in part, but I'm curious: do you think is there any? I mean, are there any social aspects or aspects of social behavior that you think, in principle, wouldn't be encouraged in this kind of way? Because I guess the gist of the cognitive map, let's say hypothesis, is that pretty much any feature that's continuous, let's say, or doesn't even have to be continuous actually, but that pretty much any aspect can be represented in a kind of map, in a map-like way. Is there anything that in principle you think shouldn't actually be represented in this way?
I think it depends on the task and relevancy. I think the dimensions emerge if they are relevant. So I wouldn't expect all information that objectively exists in the environment to be encoded in that way, unless it's relevant for you to organize it in that way. Yeah, it's so. What other aspects you imagine that would be?
Sorry, say again.
Because it's a very broad question.
Yeah, it is very broad. I guess
because I'm not sure I can pinpoint a response really.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess I was just because I guess I guess I'm just imagining that more or less anything that people think about could be included in here, and I can't really think of anything. I guess I go along roughly your lines that like obviously not everything is encoded all the time along this way. I don't know. I was for example curious whether something like a binary variable, something that just has to be binary by definition, whether something like that, you're not going to put that on a map, on a relational map.
I think that could, this might be, that's kind of how we were thinking about mental dysfunction. If it's binary instead of the map-like, then you're in trouble, right? You don't have that extended representations that gives you the flexibility and ability to interpret and make predictions if it's binary. So that could be an impairment if you don't do that. But for some variables, I imagine there is. I mean, I don't think there's one code that explains everything. It really depends on the case and the information and what is it that you need to encode. I think it would just go by the efficient representation. If it's efficient and relevant, then you would use it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you mentioned impairments in patients, and I think in one of your reviews, don't you also mention somewhere that people with depression or schizophrenia have hippocampal impairments? Is that something you're looking at all? Or are you right now staying with the non-clinical research in this area?
Yeah, there was something interesting happened here at Mount Sinai because I work in a medical school within the psychiatry department, and through conversations with psychiatrists, that finding was received with great enthusiasm. It felt like they were really looking for something like that, because the social problems, you see them in many psychiatric disorders, and many of them said that they felt that this was very fundamental and sometimes even a precursor or a cause for everything, but was in many cases regarded as like some side residual symptoms. So that was it was really well received, and then they embraced the task, and now it's running in several clinical populations. Run it in autism and borderline personality and avoidant personality, also addiction, which social aspect of addiction is very interesting. And it's true that in many of disorders, there's also hippocampal dysfunction. In autism, you see that, in schizophrenia, in depression. So you have all the components. They just need to be linked. And we're working on that. Data is in collection, so I can't really give you funding, but preliminary results to the extent we can trust them now seem to indicate some relationship within the patients, but we need more data.
Yeah, and I guess as you said earlier, it would probably be a bit naive to assume that all of this is explained with some hippocampal dysfunction. Probably all of that's a bit more complicated, but yeah, I guess it is really interesting because I guess kind of one consequence of the cognitive map hypothesis, would be that it would be implicated. I mean, not exactly, but it almost means it should be implicated in some clinical disorders just because the hypothesis is that it's so fundamental to so many aspects of behavior. So it would almost be odd if, dysfunction in this aspect would not influence all sorts of things in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think the question is, assuming that it is, then the question would be how. There's a part in Edward Tolman's review from 1948. If you go to the very end of that review, is kind of funny. He says, if I may be allowed to serve as a rat psychologist. Yeah. And he started kind of doing kind of interpretation of behavior, and he talked about neuroticism and different types of dysfunction that he kind of speculated how would they seem as a map. So, for example, a map that is too narrow, or kind of missing some distorted representation. So he already made that intuition. I think it could be. I can think of several ways that I would want to test. One is either the hippocampus is intact, but the regions that feed information into it are impaired. For example, you have a visual cortex for spatial navigation and other sensory navigation, and you have the prefrontal cortex for social information, which is like, the visual cortex of the social brain. So if impairments are in different regions, then that might impact these representations. Another option is that you have the map representation, but it's distorted, for example, by emotion. Let's say you're very sensitive to power, very much afraid or anxious. Then maybe people that are located in the area with high power, because of distortion in the space, they would even seem higher in power. So it would be a non-linear representation, which my sense is like the future of what we need to study with the maps, to shift from these like Euclidean spaces to non-linear representations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that reminds me of, I talked to Jakob Belmont about his study where they use this is a behavioral study in humans where they use this kind of trapezoid shape or whatever. It's not a square box, basically, right? It kind of narrows towards one end massively. And I think they kind of link that kind of slightly distorts the space because you suddenly don't have this like neatly angled space that you usually have. And I think it's something like that then leads to slight memory impairments in those areas. I can't remember exactly what it is, but yeah, I'm really interested in these kind of like how you can basically, to some extent, like transform these maps maybe in ways that people hadn't intended, or that.
Yes, I think they also see distortions at the borders of the map, which is also very neat. Yeah, this is a really fascinating direction.
Yeah. So is that mainly what you're doing in the next few years, or? By the way, are you still doing a lot of the kind of fear conditioning memory kind of literature, or are you?
Yes.
Okay, so it's kind of both.
Yeah, this is it's still alive and kicking in the lab, but interestingly, we're also venturing into naturalistic representations because after again many years of fear conditioning studies, which were very informative, one thing that remained unanswered is to what extent these types of processes, and even if you use computational models, and you do find correlates to psychiatric symptoms or PTSD severity, but it still doesn't touch with the core of the trauma, which is a very specific personal event. So one idea we're exploring now is we're finding ways to analyze neural data while people listen to their own memories. Or even freely recalling them. So that requires some sophisticated analysis. But again, it's the same approach, which is you do approach it mechanistically. You expect, you have a very specific algorithm in mind that could explain aspects of that behavior while they listen to that complexity. And even though it's very different across patients, because each has their own personal event, there should be something common that reflects the fact that it's traumatic. So that type of approach, we're trying to get at what makes it traumatic, or in what way it's different because it's considered traumatic. Is it just a matter of degree? Because currently our working hypothesis is that because we use this model, is that in trauma, it's the same model, the same processes that we are identifying now, only at a much more extreme level. But it could be that it's a whole different representation altogether, kind of even an alternative type of representation, maybe even not memory per se. So I think side by side, the highly controlled studies, we would like to do the more personal ones and see if we can complement or maybe find some aspects that capture that personal experience.
Cool. Sounds like I have to have you back in a few years when all the results from all the different studies are in, and I don't know. Maybe we'll find out that especially the cognitive maps can explain. You've figured out how they go wrong or what doesn't work in the different clinical groups, or maybe not. I don't know. But it sounds like there's some interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think it will merge at one point, because if you look at the trajectories of the characters, you're really looking at a storyline and at a narrative, which is memory, right? It's a series of events that people remember, and it gives it structure. So imagine how that can be distorted after a traumatic event. So I do see a way to kind of link everything, which is the emotion and the spatial or the map-like representation and the social aspect of it. I hope eventually we'll converge.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like the project you're going to do in the next 2 years. Sounds like quite the undertaking.